Welcome. I'm Mrs. Smith. Thank you for joining me today as we dip our toes into the world of 18th century printed cottons. Before we get started, let's begin with preparing our work surface. You will need a few layers of newspaper or some other kind of paper, an old towel, something to protect whatever surface you're going to be working on. Remember, the colors we're using are permanent. They will stain. They'll stain whatever they touch. So I would really not like it if our activity ruined something in your homes. I am using newspaper covered with an old tablecloth. So let's get started. And while you're preparing your work surface, I'm going to tell you a little bit about 18th century fabrics in general and printed cottons in particular. Cotton and all fabrics were very expensive. They took a lot of time to prepare, to weave, and to sew. So clothing was custom made and the fabrics were very expensive. Cotton was the most expensive because in the Americas, all of our fabrics were regulated. Our fabrics were imported. Cotton was very heavily regulated. Taxes and tariffs were placed on this, and it was all imported from either England or another country. So therefore, any fabric you had was very treasured. You took great care of it. If you could afford a piece of printed cotton, it was usually in a smaller piece like a handkerchief, a neckerchief, something small. If you could afford to have a gown, much like this one, out of a printed cotton, you were a very wealthy person. That being said, besides the taxes, another reason it was expensive was it took a lot of time to print. Remember, everything was done by hand. The Industrial Revolution had not happened yet, so everything was done by hand. Anything you see printed on here was done by hand. Most common, one of the methods was a block printing, and that's the method we'll be using today. A block print fabric was a wooden block was used, and it was inked, or paint was applied, or dye was applied to the surface of the block, which was then pressed onto the fabric over and over again in order to get whatever pattern was desired. So this is what we will be using today to make our own block prints on our fabric. I'll show you some of the reproduction fabrics we have here in my studio. We'll begin with this simple red pattern. One color was often used as it was the least expensive. Every color you added another cost to the fabric. Every color had a different block. So if you had one color, it was using one block over and over and over again to get your pattern. The next one you see is a simple vine and flower pattern. Oftentimes the flowers would be printed and the vines painted by hand. But as you can see, this one has more than one color, so that means more than one block had to be used. Every color represents a different block. This next fabric is very elaborate. It has many colors in it and would have been extremely costly to purchase. If you owned a fabric like this, it would have been a very prized possession. The last one I want to show you is one that I did using blocks here in my home studio, and I used 2 blocks and 3 colors. And out of this fabric I created a new neckerchief. So this is what we'll be doing today. We'll be looking for some shapes, some things that we can use for blocks, and making our own fabrics. Now that we looked at some of the fabrics that were produced in the 18th century, let's take a look at what we can use in our own houses to produce similar things. Now you saw the neckerchief that I made using the traditional 18th century method of a block. These are some of my block prints. My wooden stamps, wooden blocks carved with an image that I use to stamp onto fabric with. Let's take a look at what you might have at home and what I found around my house that I could use as a stamp besides these traditionally carved ones. Cookie cutters work really well. This one has many shapes on it. There's a heart. Anything with a defined line or a strong texture can be used as a stamp. These are also cookie cutters, smaller, but still they work very well. The lid from a bottle will give you either a circle or a dot. You can use either side, circle or dot. This one would give me two parallel lines about 1 inch apart. This is clothesline that I glued onto a scrap of wood. You could also wrap a string or cord or shoelaces, anything, around a piece of cardboard. Anything that gives you the ability to hold onto it while you're pressing down to stamp it. This one is a shoelace wrapped around, twisted and wrapped around, so it gives me a little bit of a texture. Styrofoam works also, gives you a very nice texture. Or leaves. These leaves I just picked out of the yard. You could also use ones from a silk plant, a fake plant. You want something that has a defined vein on the back, and that's what's going to give you your print. So those are all possibilities. Look around your house, see what you have that might work for you. Today we'll be using some of these things in our stamping. And as for your coloring, it can be food coloring, markers, acrylic paint, fabric paint would be wonderful. It's permanent, as are the markers. Food coloring may wash out. Some is more permanent than others, but these would be permanent. So these are the 3 different medium we will use today on our fabric. You also need a piece of cotton fabric to stamp on. So let's begin. Let's start with applying our paints to our palette. I use a disposable plate, something I can throw away when I'm done. A little bit of paint, doesn't take a whole lot. A sponge or a rag to apply it with. And you just dip it in, apply it to only the raised parts of your stamp. In this case, my shoelaces. And then you take it, turn it over, and press it down onto your fabric. Press for a few seconds, lift, and you have your stripes. You can repeat this pattern over and over again to get another set of stripes right next to it, or perhaps you'll want to turn it in the opposite direction and go this way. These are all choices. It's your design. You get to create it. Next, let's try food coloring. What happens when you use food coloring? Same thing. You use the same process. You dip your sponge into the coloring, apply it, to your stamp, press, and lift, and you have your circle. There's an outline of a circle. As I'm doing this, you can just imagine how long it would take to do this over and over again in order to have enough yardage to produce a garment. If you had to do this so many times, how much yardage fabric it takes to make a shirt, even a neckerchief, enough to make a gown, takes several yards of fabric, how much time it would take, multiple colors, multiple patterns. This is why 18th century fabric was treasured. Next I'd like to try a marker with you. This is a simple broad line marker, and we'll use it on the back of the leaf. If you're using a leaf, remember, you're going to color in pretty solidly, much more so than with the paint or the food coloring. You want to make sure that all of those raised surfaces, all of those ribs, and the edge of that fabric, of the leaf, get color on it so that you get the definition when you apply it to your fabric. Once that's all colored in, it's the same process. You take the leaf, you turn it upside down, and you press. Remember, if you're using a leaf that you've picked outside, make sure it's green. It can't be dried or it won't accept the color. You lift it and you have a lovely leaf pattern on your fabric. It's that simple. It's a quick process to do a few, but if you want to cover the whole fabric, like I said, it takes quite a while. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope you really have a good time discovering how you can make your patterns on your fabric. Take care.